All right, so this video is going to talk about quote integration and how to smoothly integrate your quotes into your writing. Okay, and we'll use some examples from the Crucible. So before we start, please understand that quotes should never, ever, 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 under any circumstance, stand alone as a complete sentence. What I mean by that is, here's an example. This is bad, okay? John Proctor is tired of the witch trials. I say God is dead, okay? Notice that my quote is in blue, and it's all by itself. It's standing alone as though it's its own sentence. I have one sentence in green and then I have one sentence in blue. I see that because I have a period in between. After the words witch trials, it has a period. Then I start my quote. You cannot do that. You cannot have a quote stand alone as a complete sentence. It needs to be attached to your own words within a sentence, okay? It is not a sentence by itself. It has to be attached to your sentence, okay? Some important terms that you need to understand. First of all, an independent clause. An independent clause can be independent. It's something that can stand alone as a complete sentence. But notice it's not a sentence, it's a clause, which means it's a part of a sentence. But an independent clause would be one that could be a sentence by itself. Okay? A dependent clause is dependent upon more information, meaning that's a part of a sentence that could not be a sentence by itself. It needs more information for it to be a complete idea or sentence, and I'll show you an example in just a moment. But before we start, just understand, as far as punctuating things, if you're going to use an independent clause as a lead-in for a quote, you need a colon. If you're going to use a dependent clause as a lead-in for your quote, you need a comma. Okay, so independent clause, colon, dependent clause, comma. Now, I'll show you some examples of independent versus dependent clauses in just a moment, starting with an independent clause. So this is one way that you can integrate a quote into your sentence. You can start with an independent clause and then use a colon and then add your quote. Okay, remember that an independent clause is one that could be a complete sentence on its own. So look at the part in green. It says, in Act 3 of the Crucible, John Proctor angrily responds to accusations of witchcraft. Technically, that could be a sentence all by itself, okay? He responds to the accusation of witchcraft. That's a sentence. That's an idea by itself. However, I want to attach it to my quote, so, because they're related, right? I say God is dead, and then he responds to the accusation of witchcraft. Those are related ideas, so I'm going to put them together as one sentence. If I have an independent clause, one that in green, that can stand alone by itself as a complete sentence, then I use a colon just like that, okay? So I've got my independent clause in green with a colon, and then my quote in blue, and then the parenthetical citation is in purple. Please understand that if you use a comma with an independent clause, it would create what's called a comma splice. All right, so you've probably heard comma splice before. Maybe you don't know what it is, but basically it's grammatically incorrect if I use an independent clause and a comma. You have to use a colon with it. Okay, so that is one way that you can integrate quotes into your writing. Okay, something that you need to understand too is the difference between a colon and a semicolon. Okay, don't confuse a colon with a semicolon. What you should be using in your quote integration with an independent clause is a colon. A semicolon we're going to talk about that later, but it's the one that has like the winky face, right? Or the little tear at the bottom. What you should be using with your independent clause is a colon. Okay, just 2 dots. All right. Another way you can integrate your quotes into your writing is by using a dependent clause and a comma. Remember, an independent one is the one that it can stand alone as a complete sentence. Let's read the part in green, this clause in green. It says, in Act 3 of the Crucible, John Proctor responds to accusations of witchcraft by screaming. Notice the way that clause ended, by screaming, okay? When it ends like that, it needs more information. By screaming what? Okay, so that clause is dependent on the clause to follow. And in this case, it would be my quote. So in Act 3 of the Crucible, John Proctor responds to accusations of witchcraft by screaming, I say God is dead. Miller 111. Okay, notice with the dependent clause, I used a comma. Okay, also notice that in this dependent clause, I included a lot of background information, right? I gave you that it was in Act 3. I gave you the title of the work, The Crucible. I said who's actually speaking, and I said in what situation they're speaking. That's all called context. It's also called a contextual lead-in, right? Because the quote, I say God is dead, where is that coming from? Well, now I know it's from Act 3 of The Crucible. John Proctor's saying it, and he's responding to an accusation of witchcraft, okay? More dependent clauses, though. You don't have to give all that information in your integration of your quote. You could just say, John Proctor screams, comma, I say God is dead. But if you're going to use something as simple as John Proctor screams, and it's just as simple as that, then you need to make sure that the sentence before that one has enough context that it appropriately leads into the quote better than just saying who said it. You can't just say John Proctor said, okay? Who's John Proctor? Why is he saying what he's saying? Where does this occur within the book, okay? Again, always use a comma after a says verb. Another way that you can integrate quotes into your sentences is by actually integrating them into your sentence without any punctuation. For example, in Act 3 of The Crucible, Reverend Hale quits the courts because he agrees with John Proctor that God is dead in the village of Salem. So in this example, there's not like a, here's my intro, here's my quote, so it's not chopped up. Instead, my quote actually continues my sentence, right? He agrees with John Proctor that God is dead. That's all part of it. It's all part of the sentence. So there's kind of a nice flow that goes with it. In this case, the word that replaces the comma or colon, okay? A comma or colon would be necessary without the word that most of the time, okay? No extra punctuation is necessary here. Punctuate the sentence just as you would as if all the words were your own, except, of course, include quotation marks for the words that are not your own, okay? You can shorten a quote. Notice it says in Act 2, John Proctor expresses frustration towards his wife. You forget nothing and forgive nothing. I have not moved from there to there without, I think, to please you. Notice that there are 3 dots between part of the quote. That's called an ellipses. That's when you take out a word or two from a quote, the whole thing. If you do that, if you decide to cut it down, perfectly fine. In fact, I recommend it most of the time. Okay, but if you do that, you must include an ellipses to indicate that you have changed the sentence somehow, right? You have to tell your audience, hey, I have changed this quote, okay? I have taken stuff out, and by giving the ellipses, you are letting them know what you've done, okay? Another way you can change the quote is you can actually change it and tailor it to match the grammar of your sentence, okay? So take a look. In Act 2, John Proctor expresses frustration towards his wife when he points out that Elizabeth forgets nothing and forgives nothing, okay? The original quote, if you go back to this one, says you forget nothing. Notice you forget nothing and forgive nothing, okay? In this one, it says Elizabeth forgets nothing and forgives nothing, okay? I added brackets around the parts that I added or changed because you will need to do the same thing. You use brackets when you replace or change a word to better fit the sentence. The brackets indicate that something has been altered, which again is fine. If you need to change it in order to better fit your sentence, it's perfectly fine. You just have to let your reader know that you're doing that, and you indicate that through the use of brackets. Okay, quotes are great, and I'm always okay with you using them. However, paraphrasing is also okay and appropriate. A paraphrase is your own rendition of essential information and ideas expressed by someone else presented in a new form. Wow, that was a mouthful. So it's basically your version of what somebody else said, okay? It is one legitimate way to borrow from a source, right? You still have to cite it, and you still have to give credit to somebody saying, hey, this is somebody else's idea, I'm just putting it in my own words. So you still have to cite it, but you can actually borrow from a source in that way. Essentially, it is a more detailed restatement than a summary. A summary might just give the main idea of something, but a paraphrase is going to go through all the main parts. Okay? A summary focuses concisely on a single main idea. A paraphrase is going to hit all of the main ideas. Okay, instead of identifying one overall main idea. Paraphrasing is valuable for a number of reasons because it is better than quoting information from an undistinguished passage. So if you're using a source that isn't awesome, it is better to put it into your own words because then you can kind of tailor it to your actual point. It also helps you control the temptation to quote too much. Here at Valley Christian High School, it's okay if you quote a lot. Okay, in fact, we want you to. A lot of times I want to see you quote so that I can see that you can integrate it properly. However, when you get to college, if you've got 4 or 5 quotes in one paragraph, they're gonna be like, I want to know your thoughts, not the quotes, not the actual text. So paraphrasing is a way to still reference someone else's idea without quoting constantly. okay? But again, here at Valley Christian High School, we're okay with quotes, okay? The mental process required for successful paraphrasing helps you to grasp the full meaning of the original. This is important, okay? If you can paraphrase something, then you know it well, all right? Here's why. If you were to paraphrase properly, you would reread the original passage until you understand its full meaning, and then set the original aside and write your paraphrase. Sometimes it's really tempting to have the text out while you're trying to paraphrase. You're just like, oh, then I won't forget something. The problem is when you have the text out while you're paraphrasing, you run the risk of accidentally plagiarizing, okay? Because it's not always enough to change 1 or 2 words in a sentence. You have to actually make sure that you are the one producing the sentence, okay? Because otherwise it is plagiarizing even if you're paraphrasing, okay? There has to be enough change. If you read the passage until you know what it says and then actually put it aside, then you won't be tempted to peek again and look for help, all right? Here's an example of paraphrasing. This is actually a quote, and I'm going to show you an example of a paraphrase of that quote. The quote is, "You forget nothing and forgive nothing. I have not moved from there to there without, I think, to please you." Here's my paraphrasing, and it's going to look kind of long, but it also includes context, okay? In Act 2, John Proctor expresses frustration towards his wife. That's all context, by the way, because he feels that she has not let his affair with Abigail go. Notice that is referencing that first part that says, you forget nothing and forgive nothing, right? He feels she has not let his affair with Abigail go. He watches his every move around her. I have not moved from there to there, okay? But he doesn't think she even notices his efforts. Again, you're not forgiving, or it says you forget or forgive nothing. He desires her favor, without, I think, to please you. That's the original part. But he is not sure she will ever grant it to him. So notice when I was doing that paraphrase, I was kind of referring back to the quote. The reason why I did that is because paraphrasing, you need to make sure you touch on every single main important point of what you're paraphrasing. You can't just say, he is mad because he feels like she doesn't forgive him. Okay, no, there's more to it. He watches his every move. He doesn't feel like she knows his efforts. He really wants to please her. All of that is part of the paraphrase, and all of that is part of the quote. So you need to make sure that it actually aligns up. Parenthetical citations. You must use them every time you reference someone else's work. I would err on the side of caution. If you're not sure if you should use a parenthetical citation, I would, okay? I would. Placement of parenthetical citations. Notice, here it is. In Act 3 of the Crucible, John Proctor responds to accusation witchcraft by screaming, "I say God is dead." Miller 111. Notice that there is not a period inside the quotation. The period goes outside of the parentheses. However, in this quote, I have an exclamation mark, okay? If your quote has a question mark or an exclamation mark, you can include it with the quote. But if it just has a period, leave the period out and put it at the very end after the parenthetical citation. Also notice that there is a space between the ending quotation mark and the opening parentheses. Some of you guys forget the space and it looks really jumbled and mixed together, so please remember the space there. Finally, notice that there is not a comma between the author's last name and the page number. You also don't include an abbreviation of pages. Like it doesn't say Miller pages 111 or Miller, 111. It's just Miller 111. And that's all. Thanks.